I have so much I want to say to you today about Genesis 1. I could do an entire hour's lecture. I hope that this is like opening all the little containers on the buffet, and that if you find something you'd like to chew on, that you'll just pause there, or maybe call me up and let's sit down, or after church we can talk, because Genesis 1 is so important and has been misused in so many different ways. Genesis 1 is used often by people who say that there's some divide between God and the Bible and science. And it's nonsense. But along the way, I think as we look at what happens in Genesis 1, we can come to understand the vast expanse of God, the beautiful poetry of the Bible, and find ourselves within this astonishing text. In the Middle East, most of the Semitic words for the word temple are simply the word house of. And so you could have the house of Mark, or you could have the house of Aphrodite, or the house of Venus. To be a temple was simply the place where this god resided. And there were temples all around the Middle East. Of course, in Jerusalem, there was a great temple built by Solomon, which they referred to as actually God's footstool. The Jews thought too much of God to think God would live in their house. God just kind of propped his ankles up there at the end of the day. But in 586, Babylonian troops breached the walls of Jerusalem and demolished the temple and hauled off all of the precious things that were within it, including the people. And there by the waters of Babylon, the priests sat and wept, for they remembered that they had been able to worship God, to offer sacrifice to God, to do the things that God had told them to do in the Exodus story. And now those were all gone. And it might have appeared with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem that God, as they knew him, Elohim, Yahweh, had disappeared from the face of the earth. God no longer had a home on earth, except the priestly author thought, no, God's bigger than that. And so this first chapter of Genesis, the Hebrew word Genesis just means beginning. In fact, if you want to look at your first book of the Bible, it's the book of beginnings. This first book of the Bible needed a new preface, a new way to understand. There's a second story of creation that follows in Genesis 2. You'll remember Adam and Eve in the garden and God blowing into the mud. That's an earlier story about what God did. But here around the year 586, or maybe a little later, a little closer to 500 BCE, the priests wrote down a story that said, our God is bigger. Most of the creation stories that we find in the Middle East have warfare involved. Husbands fighting wives, siblings fighting each other, great creatures in the sea fighting against great creatures in the air, the sea being associated with women and femininity, and the air being associated with men. And there are all these battles and struggles, and pieces fly out, and that creates the world. But the priestly writer says, no, it was far more orderly than that. Although he begins with exactly the same words as the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, in the beginning when God began to create, from there on, it's a completely different story. First off, God is central. There is no other actor in creation in the first chapter of Genesis. It is only God who does things. God is essential, and God faces into the chaos. And then the author gives us 6 days in magnificent storytelling form. He gives us 6 days. Days 1, 2, and 3 have God do one thing, and then 2 things. And then days 4, 5, and 6 have God do one thing, and 2 things. This is the way I preach, friends. This preacher and I have something in common in that he has these fence posts. He wants you to know about each day, and each day God does 2 things. God says something, and God said, and then God called it something. God named it. In the first 3 days from the ordering of creation, we find God coming in and setting things to right. There was this formless void, and the winds of God, the Spirit, the breath of God was moving over this chaos. And so God says, let there be light. The first act God has is a word that comes from God's mouth. God does not put a nuclear reactor together or an electric light bulb. God simply says, let there be, and there was. And light and darkness emerge. And then God says in the second day, let there be a dome in the waters that divides the waters above and the waters below. Now, this is a different understanding of the world. The first authors of the Bible believed the world to be flat. And above that flat world, there was a flat dome that kept the sky from falling into the land. But here it is that God says, let there be a dome. And God makes the dome that separates the above from the what's here. The sky is created. And then in the third day, God does two things. God makes dry land, a place for things to be. And then God puts vegetation in that. All of these are an act of making a form from what is formless. What was hard to understand now becomes understandable in terms of light and dark, sky above and earth below, and then dry land and vegetation. But God's not done. That's 3 days, morning and evening, 3 days. And now God goes to fulfilling, populating. And he goes right back, the storyteller goes right back to that let there be light. And now God creates the moon and the stars and the sun. The second piece of building creation is the fulfilling. He'd separated light from dark, and now it is the fulfilling. But then the second population is that he's got sky and he's got sea, and he populates them with birds and sea monsters and fish. And you wonder, why did God have to make sea monsters? Well, those Babylonians, they loved their sea monsters. In fact, the sea monsters were the women force in the world that transformed the world by populating the world. And so it is that the Genesis teller, the priestly teller, says, those silly Babylonians think that it was sea monsters that populated the earth. We know that God populated the earth with sea monsters. Leviathan will show up every so often just to throw off another lay reader who wants to know what Leviathan is. It's a sea monster. At one point in the Psalms, God chops up the sea monster Leviathan and gives it to the people of the desert for food. So here we find ourselves in that fifth day. God has populated the air with birds and the sea with fish, and he says to all of the other Semitic storytellers of creation, you got it all wrong. My God made that. And then day 6, just like on day 3, God does two things. First, God puts the wild animals on the earth, cattle and all the beasts of the earth. God populates the world with moving things on the earth, which God had made in day 3. And then God makes humankind in the divine image. When you look at your hand, you are looking at the image of the divine. When you look at your beloved, you are looking at the image of God. In fact, you will never see a human being that God does not love, who God made in God's own image. Here in this moment, at the pinnacle of creation, we find humankind being made in God's image and given dominion over the land and the sea. Now, unfortunately, some people took that into the doctrine of discovery and said, well, God gave us control of everything. We ought to go out there and beat it all down. Dominion has a lot more to do with stewardship and care and overseeing. God gave us this earth and told us that we were the ones that were to look after it in the image of the divine who had made it all. And so this creation story of 6 days, one thing, two things, one thing, two things. God says and God calls. God says and God proclaims a name. And it was evening and it was morning another day. Not originally my talk, but just a word about it. It was evening and it was morning and it was another day. In the Jewish tradition, the day begins at sunset. When your head goes down on your pillow and you say, now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. That's the time when you put yourself in God's care through the night. And when you wake up in the morning, you can figure out what God did in the night, and then you have 12 hours to live before it becomes dark again. This cycle is a pretty healthy one, and I encourage you to think about it from time to time. The prayer book prayers for evening prayer and Compline are all about commending ourselves into God's care, into the angels' care, to those that watch over us when we are defenseless and in our sleep. And it comes right from this piece in the Bible. After 6 days, it says, God finished the work that God had done, and God rested on the seventh day. The priestly caste also knew that in the midst of labor, in the midst of creation, in the midst of doing, there also had to be a moment of reflection, of understanding, of coming to be in that place where one has found oneself. And on the seventh day, God rested. Probably God took a nice nap. I think that's a really good thing for God to do. I think it's a really good thing for humans to do. But Sabbath isn't just about rest. It's also about that chance to look and see everything that God has done and that it is good. This Genesis passage offers us the opportunity to see creation through the divine eyes, to see what God has done in this world. Oh, I know we've created wonderful things in our lifetime. There are things that are happening today that we could not have imagined 50 or 100 or 1,000 years ago. But the fact is that all of it is under God's umbrella. It's not the product of sibling rivalry or the murder of a wife or a husband. It's not the matter of sea monsters or eagles in the sky. It's a matter of God's bringing creation to fulfillment. And the people around you, those are God's reminder of that because they are all made in God's image and likeness. And so as the book of beginnings begins, this Genesis account helps us to understand how we fit. But it also helped the priests to remember the temple. Remember, I started with the house of. The temple in Genesis is all of creation. And the creation story takes us on a walk. You know how when you're standing out there and you're getting ready to come into church and you're hauling in all the things that have happened to you in the last week, the difficulties and the sorrows, the pain of those around you, the confusing moments of your life? That's that chaos. That's before God begins to create. And the 3 days that we find God doing things to separate the darkness from the light, that's part of what the temple did. It allows us to come in and confess the wrongs that we have done, to let go of the burdens that we carry. And so those 3 days in which God spent trying to get things organized are 3 days that we spend here in the temple. And then there's the fulfilling that comes along, that fulfilling that says, you have a purpose in this world, friends. God didn't put you randomly here to run around. Instead, God has plan and purpose for you. And so days 4, 5, and 6, as God populates the world, God also populates you, feeding you with the bread of life, feeding you with the call to be out into God's world. And here on that Sabbath day, the Holy of Holies, that special place in the temple where God's toes got propped up on the footstool of the temple, that's a moment for you to catch your breath when God says, I've got this, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. This Genesis account is a giant picture that the temple priests, who no longer had a temple, could offer the world the sense that this was God's temple, all of creation, the galaxies, the black holes, the suns, the rivers, the lakes, the food, the animals. It's all God's temple. And so as we regulate our lives according to this Genesis story, these beginning stories, we can move from the chaos into the place of Sabbath rest. We can move from disorder into order. We can move from unfulfilled to fulfilled. This Genesis story has so much to offer, and it's not about fighting with scientists. It's about God's love poured out in the world. God loves scientists too, and God imparts upon them the knowledge and the wisdom and the skill to help us to be better than we were before. But along the way, this book of beginnings asks each of us to take a beginning, to walk with those sad temple priests by the rivers of Babylon and know that everything belongs to God. Amen.